Let me start the recording. All right.
Okay. Well, thank you all for attending. My name is Chalrlie Rafkin. I'm a PhD student in economics at MIT. This work is joint with Sam Asher, who's a professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and Paul Novosad, who's a professor at Dartmouth College. And it's called Intergenerational Mobility in India, New Methods and Estimates Across Time, Space, and Communities. So I'll motivate this talk by pointing out the fact that probably everybody in the Zoom room already knows, which is just that the last 3 decades have been an economic miracle in India. And so this figure plots the distribution of consumption from 1983 to 2012. And as you can see, consumption has increased across the distribution from a mean of something like 1,500 to a mean of maybe 1,800, but also higher, much higher at the bottom of the distribution. And that rightward shift in the distribution has also occurred in terms of education levels, where the open black bars plot the education levels in 1983 and the filled in green bars plot them in 2012. And so against that backdrop of this real economic miracle, there are 2 stories prominently circulated in the media about this miracle. So the first is that perhaps markets are overturning all old hierarchies. And so it might be the case that caste identities are less important in cities, which are growing. There's been political mobilization of marginalized groups and perhaps growing equality of opportunity. And so you can see here a nice New York Times headline that says, "Scaling caste walls with capitalism's ladders in India." But a second story is that India might be special, perhaps because there's this persistence of traditional social structures. So there are widely circulated stories about punishments of people who violate norms, even in cities. There might be identity-based politics and persistent inequality. And so, for example, The Economist had an article that said, "Why caste still matters in India." And so in this talk, we'll try to figure out which of those 2 stories is the case. And so our narrow goal is to estimate intergenerational mobility in India across subgroups and across time to understand whether or not capitalism, we're scaling caste walls with capitalism's ladders, or whether or not it's this story of persistence. But one challenge here, a methodological challenge, which I'll touch on, is just that it's very difficult to measure mobility in India because of measurement challenges with measuring education within different subgroups. And this has to do with a sort of technical issue about bottom coding of different education groups. And so we'll apply a new methodological technique to bound intergenerational mobility, which leads to a new mobility measure called bottom half mobility, and I'll get into that in a moment. And then applying that methodological tool, we have the following results. First is that we find that there's no change in mobility from pre-liberalization to the present. So it's really that second story about persistence that we find. The second is that we find substantial variation across towns, villages, and neighborhoods. So there's big geographic heterogeneity in intergenerational mobility. Third is that we find an increase in IM among scheduled castes and tribes, but we find that Muslims are doing worse, particularly among boys. And then we find some suggestive evidence that affirmative action is a key channel for divergence. And so I'll just pause here before getting into the meat of the presentation to see if anybody has a question about what I've shown so far. Okay, so then I'll kind of get started. I'll say that this project is kind of against the backdrop of a larger research agenda that I have with Paul and Sam, where we're really interested in studying intergenerational mobility, applying these different tools. And so just to be on the same page about what IM means, we think of intergenerational mobility as the dependence of children's social status on their parents' social status. So it's a measure of equality of opportunity. It has implications for income inequality, but we think of this as a different measure. And as you may be aware, this is a central political issue, especially subgroup mobility. And so this is important, particularly in India. Cool. So I'll now just touch on some of these methodological challenges. So how do you measure intergenerational mobility? Well, here I'm taking a figure from a very famous paper by Raj Chetty and co-authors published in 2014, where on the x-axis here, we have parent income rank. And on the y-axis, we have child income rank. And the function that relates parent income rank to child's income rank, we'll think of as the conditional expectation function, CEF, and we'll refer to this as E of y given x. And so some common mobility measures are absolute upward mobility, which is mobility at the 25th percentile. And you can think of this as kind of the median child income given being in the bottom half of the income distribution. So that would be like the outcome attained for a child who's born around here in the income distribution. Then there's also absolute downward mobility, which is P25, and that's the outcome for a child born at the 75th percentile. And then there's also the rank gradient, which is like the slope of this best fit line for this function. So those are traditional income measures, income mobility measures. We'll present to you a different but related measure that we think has some advantages in this setting. And so one challenge with estimating intergenerational mobility in developing countries is that matched parent-child income data, like the Chalrlie et al. Paper has, is rarely available. And so when it is available, parent-child income data is unreliable. And a key issue here is measurement error, which is that if you measure a child's income at a given point, that income is going to be so noisy, and it's going to look like there's actually higher measured mobility than there really is. And there are some other kind of challenges in the weeds here, like how do you attribute household income when you have subsistence farmers to different co-resident parents and children? And those types of challenges kind of vanish in developed countries with very sophisticated tax systems that collect granular high-resolution income data every year. And so many studies in developing countries, as a result, use education as a y-axis. And so that's arguably the best available proxy for lifetime income that we have. And so what does the CEF look like in India? Well, one challenge here is that you are able to get a measure of the CEF, so you have much fewer bins, but one challenge is just that you don't have any visibility between the bins here. So on the x-axis here, we're plotting father education rank. On the y-axis, we're plotting son education rank. And this dot represents the average son education rank among children whose parents are illiterate. The second bin represents children of parents who have 2 years of education, 4 years of education, and so on. And so in comparison with the Chalrlie et al. Data, where you have very granular income ranks, here you really only have 7 bins. And so it's much harder to estimate some of these other measures because of the interval censoring. Does that make sense? And that's just a natural problem that emerges when you use education in lieu of incomes. And so when you want to compare CEFs over time, you have this big interval censoring problem that makes it very difficult to compare the 1980 to the 1960 birth cohorts to say something about how intergenerational mobility has changed over time in India. And so our strategy uses what's called a partial identification approach, where we bound the set of feasible mobility functions. And so we'll obtain the conditional expectation function of child rank given parent education percentile rank, and then we'll build on solutions in the econometric literature to get a nice bound on what these mobility measures could be given this data challenge. And so here is what the CEF could be with all this interval censoring, and these bounds show what the possible bounds could be, possible CEFs could be. And then applying our methodology, we can substantially tighten these bounds. And by layering on additional assumptions, you can get tighter and tighter bounds. And so I won't go into too many of the details here, but suffice to say that we focus on a function of the CEF, which we'll call mu AB, which means the average mobility conditional on being born in the bottom of the income distribution. And so you can think of this as the expected child rank, so the expected outcome for a child whose parent comes from the bottom 50% of the income distribution. It's a very close analog to this P25 measure that I briefly touched on. And in fact, they coincide if the CEF is linear. But it turns out that this function can be bounded much more precisely. And so that's all I have on the kind of nitty-gritty methodological details. But
Chalrlie, I just had one quick question.
Yes.
So like the bottom 50 ranking, which is based on education, you said that it's closely related to P25.
Yes.
Is that just happening here due to the data set, or I mean, is that like a theoretical result?
Great question. So what is P25 and what is mu50? So I'll focus on this graph. I'll focus on the Chetty et al. Graph just to abstract away from the issues with interval censoring. P25 is the value of the y-axis when you have the x-axis at 25, when you're looking at the function evaluated at 25. Mu050 is the average value between 0 and 50, so kind of integrating over the entire distribution. So P25 you can think of as the median outcome for somebody who's born to the median parent, is the average outcome for somebody who's born to the median parent in the bottom of the income distribution. Mu050 is the average outcome for somebody who's born to the average of parents in the bottom 50%. And when the function is exactly linear, as in perhaps this gray bound in the United States, then mu050 and P25 precisely coincide. If the function is curved, then they don't coincide and they can differ, just like the median and mean can differ in that case. And that has to do with Jensen's inequality. So the average across the bottom of the distribution can differ from evaluating the function at the average value. But in many cases, they'll be closely linked. In the India data, you have a convex function. It's clearly not linear. And so they won't exactly coincide, but sort of the concept is related to each other. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. Okay, so I'll move on to the data sets that we leverage here. So we really build on two data sets. The first is the India Human Development Survey taken in 2012. What's nice about this data set is that people are asked about their parents' education, which, because education is static, so people in their 30s primarily are not getting too much more education, that allows us to get at mobility going back 30 years. And it also has very nice subgroup characteristics like caste and religion. And then we'll also look at the socioeconomic and caste census in 2012. And this is a complete enumeration of household demographics and assets, and one of the many administrative data sources that's used internally by the government. One challenge here is that we can only use co-resident sons who co-reside with their fathers, and we can't look at women. And so, because women by age 20 to 23, many of them do no longer live with their family, particularly if they're married. And so, the two data sets will complement each other in that way. And I'll say that if you're interested in economic data on India, there is this data set called the Shrug, which is being led by my co-authors, Paul and Sam. This is a high-resolution aggregation of remote sensing and administrative data comprising 500,000 villages, 8,000 towns, and 4,000 other geographies from 1990 to the present. And you can access it online. And so we think this is a very exciting new platform to harmonize data efforts in India, including for COVID-19. So what are the results? First, I'll touch on fathers and sons. So here is upward mobility over time. And there are two things to note about this figure. The first is that moving from 1950s to the 1985, these are birth cohorts. So somebody born in 1985 is like somebody who is 35 today. And what you can see is that the upward mobility has been basically constant from the 1950s birth cohort to the 1980s birth cohort. And it is lower than in the United States or in Denmark. And so this is kind of a new fact about India that isn't known, is whether or not India would be more or less mobile than these other countries. And it turns out that it's much less mobile and it's sort of flat over time. The second kind of key finding is that upward mobility has been decreasing for some groups and increasing for others. So in the black bars here, we plot forward and other castes. In red, we show scheduled castes. In green, we show scheduled tribes. And then in indigo, we show Muslims. And upward mobility has been rising for scheduled castes and for scheduled tribes, but has been decreasing for Muslims. And there's sort of this break around the mid-1960s. Meanwhile, it's been flat for forward and other castes. And so conditional on being born in the bottom half of the distribution, outcomes for Muslims are really decreasing over this 20-year period in terms of birth cohorts. We don't see the same divergence in terms of downward mobility. So these are the expected outcomes conditional on being born in the top half of the distribution, where we see it's sort of flat for forward and other, and then increasing for all groups. And so we see most of this divergence is really in the bottom half of the distribution. Next, we look at mothers and daughters. And so I'll say there are two challenges about looking at intergenerational mobility among women. The first is just that the interval data problem is much worse for mothers. And so you can think of this as, particularly for the older birth cohorts, the share of women who are illiterate is very high. And so that makes it just that much harder to bound outcomes in the bottom half of the distribution because so many people are sort of indistinguishable in the data. And then the second is that daughters become non-resident at much younger ages. And our approach here is that we'll look, instead of looking at intergenerational mobility only, we'll also look at the share who exceed a certain education level. And so, here's just a plot. This isn't mobility, this is just level outcomes. But as is well known, there's been some catch up for women in terms of the average education attained by birth cohort. So in the 1960s, there was a gap of about 3 years in terms of the average years of education obtained between men and women. And by the 1990s birth cohort, that had shrunk to about a year. And so that's encouraging, but there's still a level difference. But it's unknown how that translates into mobility. So there's how women born to mothers or fathers in the bottom half differ from men born to mothers or fathers born in the bottom half. And so this just shows you how much interval censoring there is. Among people in the 1960s, the share who are indistinguishable in the data because they all are illiterate is like 80%. And so it makes it very hard. You can imagine many different CEFs that are consistent with these bin means. So first, we look at mu 0 to 80.
I just had another quick question, if that's okay.
Please.
So for like both the father-son ranks and mother-daughter that you showed right now, both those functions look kind of convex. Is that like a routine thing, or are there like countries which have those relationships as linear?
So what we see in the United States for income ranks is that the relationship is linear. Here, it happens to be convex. I'm not sure about other countries for education, whether or not it would be convex. But the intuition for this is just that there's very, very large increasing returns to obtaining higher education in India. And so that's kind of consistent with that intuition, but I'm not sure how general that phenomenon is, but it's a great observation.
Thanks.
Great. So here we're just plotting mu 0 to 80, which permits us to get tighter bounds for mothers and daughters. And what we find is the following. We just plot different mu 0 to 80 ratios or measures between these 4 different groups. Mothered son, which is looking at the intergenerational mobility among sons. Then mother-daughter, intergenerational mobility among daughters born to mothers who are illiterate or who are in the bottom 80%. And then we look at father-son and father-daughter. So these are outcomes for sons or daughters born to fathers in the bottom 80%. And what you see here is that while mother-son and mother-daughter are bounded a little bit less precisely, it looks like mother-daughter upward mobility is slightly lower, although not so much lower, about a percentage point, rank point lower, I guess, for mother-daughters. And then father-son and father-daughter are a little bit similar. And so the sort of takeaway here is that girls with less educated mothers are particularly likely to experience poor outcomes, relative to girls born to fathers who are less educated. And so the education of the mother may be a particularly important channel for women, but less so for men. So the third set of results is about mobility across space. So using the SECC, we can develop very granular measures of intergenerational mobility across India. And what you can see is that there's striking heterogeneity, where there's a lot of intergenerational mobility in the south of India and less so in the north. So in Kerala, Tamil Nadu, you can see that there's a lot of intergenerational mobility as indicated in the green. But in the northern states, as you might expect, there is much less upward mobility. And then you can also see some little dots of upward mobility, which represent here in the north, some of the larger cities are a little bit more mobile, and that's these little green dots, which kind of stand out against the less mobile rural areas. But when you zoom in at the local level, there's substantial variation in intergenerational mobility. And so here we just plot intergenerational mobility within Delhi. And so this is a Yamuna River. And you can see that in the wealthier outlying suburbs, there's a lot more mobility than in the center of the city where many Muslims reside. And one ambition that we have is to generate these sorts of maps for other cities, many other cities in India. So then leveraging some of the measures of assets in the country, we're able to look at what predicts rural mobility. And what we find is that consumption and years of education tend to predict upward mobility rank gains. But we see some effect of different village assets like primary schools, high schools, paved roads, or power. Segregation is a negative predictor. Land inequality is a negative predictor. But consumption inequality plays no role. And these are just correlations. So you should take them with a grain of salt, but we think they're kind of suggestive of the types of assets that might be useful for increasing mobility in these different rural areas. We also look at urban-rural gaps between sub.
I'm sorry. I just had a question. Could you just go to the previous slide? Hi. So I wanted to know, so in your previous graph, when you were plotting Muslim, scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, so are these such reasons also listed out, or have you all investigated what could be the cause, or what is the difference? What has led to the difference between the ranks amongst these groups?
Can you ask? You're asking, have we looked into what has led to the persistence of ranks among which groups?
Yeah. So why is there a difference? Like, so this is like way in the beginning of your presentation, there was this particular graph where you showed the mobility for Muslims, scheduled caste, and scheduled tribe. So I wanted to ask if the reasons for such difference was investigated.
Yes. So that's, I'll get to that in the last part of the talk, because I agree that that is a really striking divergence. It's one of the main findings of the paper. And so we find suggestive evidence that affirmative action policies are responsible for lifting the outcomes of scheduled caste, scheduled tribes. And many of those policies are not available to Muslims.
All right, okay.
And so I'll explain that in the next couple of slides. But it's a great question, very important part of the paper.
Sure.
I just had another question on this plot. So average remoteness has like a positive impact on expected upward mobility?
Yeah, what I'll say here is that I think these correlations are interesting. My sort of view is that these correlations should motivate further research, but they shouldn't be a takeaway because they are just correlations. So, it could be a few things. First is that average remoteness may be negatively correlated with the share of Muslims in the area. And we know that Muslims have lower upward mobility. Muslims may tend to reside more in cities. So that's one possibility. This isn't controlling for, I don't believe that this is controlling for the share of Muslims that are there, although I have to check. It may actually be a joint regression, but that's just a quick view.
Yeah. No, because it's just that like that's the only one which is kind of like, unexpected. All others are like probably more intuitive. Like that's why
Yep.
kind of jumped out.
It's a great thing for us to look into. I don't have a clean answer.
Yeah, thanks.
So we also look within urban rural areas at the differences between social group. And so I'll just focus on panel B for the sake of time. What we find is that in rural areas, there's this big rank difference between Muslims and between Muslims and forwards. And so this 13-point difference is the difference between Muslims and forwards. The negative 3-point difference is the difference between scheduled castes and forwards. But we find that in urban areas where you might have expected more mobility, at least I would have ex ante expected more mobility, we actually find that there's a divergence among Muslims, even less mobility among urban Muslims relative to rural Muslims when you compare it to forward and other. And so urbanization is sort of not suggestively, at least, a silver bullet here, although this is also not a correlation, or this is also not causal, just a correlation. So now to answer Admika's question, we look at some of the mechanisms for changing scheduled castes and tribes versus Muslims. We look at 5 different mechanisms: the geography of mobility, returns to education, occupation structure, fertility, and affirmative action. And so first we'll rule out some of these ancillary mechanisms. So we ask, do Muslims just live in low mobility areas? And what we find is that when we look within state or within district, we're not able to purge this difference between Muslims and forwards and others. And so this difference persists even when you look very closely within district. And so it doesn't seem like it's just that Muslims are living in low mobility areas. The next question we have is whether Muslims might have lower returns to education. So we run something from economics called the Munsarian regression across data sets. And we do not find evidence that Muslims have lower returns to education than scheduled castes or scheduled tribes. Next, we ask whether education might just be less important for small-scale entrepreneurs. And so many Muslims are shopkeepers in cities, and so perhaps they're not obtaining an education because they're kind of going into informal apprenticeships with their family business, and that wouldn't be detected in the data. And so you could see, many more Muslims own these sort of businesses than for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. But what we find is that this divergence persists even among the 70% of Muslims who do not own a household business. And so it doesn't seem like this can really explain all of the difference. And then the last possibility is just perhaps Muslims have differential fertility, so they just have more children. And if that were the case, that could explain why they may attain less education because there's less household resources. And we do not find that Muslim fertility can explain more than a quarter of the mobility gap. And so instead we look at affirmative action, and we focus on affirmative action among scheduled tribes. And so following this paper by Guillaume Cassan, we exploit changes in how SCs are classified in the 1970s, where there's a harmonization across different jatis, where SCs, people from different families, are kind of being moved into scheduled caste status within states. And then we look at whether or not these between states, these scheduled castes are receiving affirmative action. And so in the red bars, we're looking at early SC groups. And in early years, there's this big gain in mobility among these early SC groups. In later SC groups who are moved arbitrarily into SC status, you only see this gain in mobility in later years, once they're moved into SC status and they receive affirmative action. And so this is sort of suggestive evidence that once you receive affirmative action, that tends to improve outcomes among those groups. And when we move this into a regression framework, we actually find that it can explain all of the Muslim SC divergence. Now, I think this is not completely clean evidence because the designations that we have are relatively coarse. We're looking at coarse birth years, but we think it's at least consistent with the story that affirmative action can be very helpful for mobility, and that affirmative action among SCs can explain their growth during this time period, the growth in mobility. So with that, I will wrap up. What we find is that using this mobility measure that we newly developed, mu050, we can now generate valid subgroup and across time and country comparisons for intergenerational mobility. And we find that low social status is increasingly persistent among Muslims, and there's a divergence from SCs and STs, but that overall intergenerational mobility has been flat in India over the past 20 or 30 years. And then we find a nice channel for intergenerational mobility, a suggestive channel at least, is affirmative action for scheduled castes. And so hopefully in future work, we intend to look at local mobility estimates in the Shrug, which is this data set led by Paul and Sam. And they also have a new paper on segregation, access to public goods, and economic outcomes that they'll be releasing with co-authors. So with that, I'll conclude. I would be happy to have a bit of a discussion if people have questions or thoughts.
Chalrlie, could you, can I bother you just to explain what is affirmative action? So does it got to do with grouping, like you group them, or what is it exactly?
So my understanding is that there are these reserved seats at universities for the scheduled caste groups, and that the scheduled caste groups receive these reserved seats at universities, so kind of preference in education. And so the early SC groups always had access to them, and then there was a redesignation such that these late SC groups who were moved into scheduled caste status received the reservations.
All right. Okay. Well, we don't see this for Muslims in India. So I just want to understand, how did this extrapolate to the Muslim group as well? I can see that the SCs have it, but how did you do it?
So I think the idea is that SCs have it, and so that can explain why the red moves up. But intergenerational mobility across subgroups is zero sum. And so if some group moves up, to some extent, that implies that another group has to move down.
Okay.
Now, I think you're pointing out a really good point, which is that, it doesn't necessarily explain why Muslims had to go down. And it could be the case that it could be some SCs would go up, but then others would, it could be the case in principle that SCs could go up, but it wouldn't necessarily lead to Muslims going down. And so we don't have a great explanation necessarily for why the reduction occurred among Muslims, but it can at least suggest why the green and red went up. And then the fact that Muslims didn't receive it is at least suggestive of why they might have gone down.
Right.
I just had one quick question. So know that like most of these results were kind of like mu50, and I guess at one place it was mu80. What happens if you do this by like quintile? And the reason I ask is because there is like the big myth is about the Indian middle class. right? So like people from like 40 to 80 actually are probably same across a lot of socioeconomic characteristics. So
that's great. So I don't actually know off the top of my head what mu 40 to 80 looks like. The reason why we look at mu 0 to 50 is because it turns out that can be tightly bounded, but there's probably an analog to looking at the middle class that can also be bounded tightly. And so you're right, that might directly answer some of the questions about, yeah, the rising middle class in India. And I'm not sure that I've looked at that.
also on a different note, so like maybe a super rushed up judgment out of this would be that well, we should just give Muslims affirmative action and then things will be better. So in that regard, what do you think are kind of like the policy implications of this kind of work?
So I think, that's one possible conclusion. And I think the data are at least consistent with that. I'm not sure I can advocate for that because I think that would be extrapolating from the paper. But I think, what we find is that the data are consistent with affirmative action increasing the outcomes for scheduled casts. And so I think, at the very least, you could say that might have been successful for the groups that have received it.
Yeah, but I mean, I guess like one counter that I could imagine to that is that if like upward mobility is a zero-sum game, then it doesn't matter if like whoever gets the affirmative action is going to move up and like the other groups are going to move down, right?
So I think there's room for improvement. So it's not zero sum. I should have been a bit more precise. It's not zero sum among the bottom. One thing that could happen is that outcomes improve for everybody in the bottom, but they become more flat with respect to the top of the distribution. And so if what you're very concerned about is like everybody in the entire country, when you're born, you have the same chance, then it would be 50 for everybody, including at the top of the distribution. And so one possibility is that, what could happen is that if you gave affirmative action to everybody, that it would create equality between the bottom and the top of the distribution, not just a zero sum across subgroups. And so I was a little bit imprecise 5 minutes ago when I said that it's zero sum because I wasn't reflecting about the top of the distribution.
Yeah, that makes more sense. With respect to like geographic variations or heterogeneity,
yeah.
Is there a reason why that's happening? Like, have you looked at it?
Well, I think a few comments. First is that geographic heterogeneity and mobility is also true in the United States. It's a big takeaway from Chetty et al. And so it might be the case that, because of differences in local amenities in every country, within every country, even, wealthy countries, there are these very localized differences in intergenerational mobility. I think in India, it's particularly not surprising to me where, as you know, there's just enormous differences even within Mumbai or Delhi between local amenities, like from street to street. And so I think I'm not surprised necessarily that you would find between states, wealthy states like Kerala, having much more intergenerational mobility than less wealthy states in the north.
I also had like a super dumb question. Does this take into account like within and beyond country migration, like when you're looking at birth cohorts?
So we don't study the effects on migrants. All the people who are in the IHDS are people who remain within India. Now so that's immigration out of India. And I think within India, we are able to see in the IHDS, we should be able to capture migration, but one challenge is just that it may be, so we should be able to capture migration in the IHDS because even if somebody, if they're interviewed in Kerala, but they were born in, I don't know, Goa, that's okay because they'll just say, you know, they're interviewed in Kerala and they're asked about their parents, and that's fine. So I think we should be okay. One kind of important question is whether or not migration could affect the SECC geographic estimates, which are actually the ones plotted here. We're mostly looking at co-resident sons, which is like the vast majority of sons at age 20 to 23. But there's an important possibility that among the share that we don't capture, there's bias. And in the paper, we do very important and careful work to suss out the extent to which we think there is bias, robustness checks, and we think there probably isn't very much bias from migration in terms of affecting the co-residence estimates. Then Atmika had a question in the chat about affirmative action for women.
Yeah, I just typed it out so that I don't forget it. So I want to know if I noticed that in the mother, daughter, father, all the correlations, you said that educating mothers could result in an upward trend of women being, being more educated. So can affirmative action for women could result in upward mobility? Do you think that what could be one of the takeaways from the study?
So it's possible. This is looking only at men, and so I'm not sure for women. One thing that we might do in a future version of the paper is add the figures for women, but I'm not sure what the results look like now. So I'm not sure if affirmative action for women would generalize in this way for intergenerational mobility.
The reason I say that is because we do have a reservation for women in India in multiple places. So I just wanted to know if that would be something that you could look into.
It's worth looking into. I think what's nice about this, the setting for the SCs is that there's this sort of arbitrary change in scheduled caste status that allows you to have a natural experiment. Whereas the reservations for women in India could be driven by other factors, like the states that have it are kind of increasing in their equality already, women leaders in their local governments, and so that could be affecting mobility independently of the affirmative action policies. And so, whereas here it's a very clean natural experiment, but I think it's an important point that we could shed some light on these gender differences potentially by looking at affirmative action.
I had like another, again, like this is mostly because I actually don't know how upward mobility is like actually calculated, so this may or may not make sense. But how is kind of like the general like the distributional inequality, like how does that impact like the upward mobility at like bottom and top ends?
So it's a great question. One of the objectives of IM is to separate inequality from mobility, where inequality is like the share of wealth that is captured by the top of the distribution. And so you can think of a classic measure in economics as the Gini coefficient, whereas intergenerational mobility is the persistence of wealth across generations. And so inequality is kind of a snapshot, whereas mobility is like the conversion in wealth from period to period. So one of the, I'll kind of, without getting into the technical details, what I'll say is that the mobility measures that we have, I don't think I have a slide on this, but seek to separate that. And they do that by looking at ranks, which conceptually separate inequality from mobility, because ranks are uniform by construction. So if you line everybody up, it's sort of equally dense at every part of the bottom of the distribution, whereas levels, there can be big concentration because lots of people, if you look at levels of education, many people are going to be illiterate, whereas very few people will be, have a college education in India. And so that will kind of reflect more of inequality. So that's sort of the high level answer. Then there's a question in the chat about the pandemic. It's hard for me to forecast. I think what I would say is that one important consideration is the extent to which the pandemic adversely affected the bottom of the distribution, which seems very plausible, relative to the top of the distribution, and the extent to which that will affect the changes in mobility over, the transmission of status over time. And so my conjecture is that it's very clear that the pandemic, at least in theory, could have effects on inequality, but it's a bit more of a speculative to say how it might affect mobility, because that really says, how is this going to change the status that's transferred to children built up over many years versus just, the level hit to people's wealth that could affect inequality today.
Also, just to make sure, so IM is like a measure, right? Like you can calculate IM for incomes, for like education ranks. So this could also be useful to look at other like socioeconomic or even like health characteristics, right?
Absolutely. So, but what you need is information on both the parents and the children. But yes, it's kind of a measure that describes the joint relationship between two groups. So anytime that you can do a correlation, you can do this kind of IM to some extent, or you can do this mu050. And an example is in a companion paper where we develop a related measure. We look at the concentration of the concentration of mortality among the bottom of the education distribution in the United States. And so we look at how mortality has become transmitted by education and is really concentrated among those with low educations over time. And so, as you can see, that's not just intergenerational mobility. Has, as we hope, a wide number of applications.
Yeah, because for India, like that's exactly what I was thinking. That like two public health related things where we can have like good birth cohort data is like life expectancy and like all-cause mortality risk. So maybe this could be done there as well.
Yeah, it's a great idea to look at mu050 for mortality in India. It's something that I should raise to my co-authors. I think they might be interested. So
yeah. Well, are there any more questions? If not, then I guess we have taken Chalrlie's enough time today.
Well, I'm always happy to answer more questions, and you should feel free to reach out to me on email. I really appreciate the invitation to come speak. It was really fun.
Of course, yeah, it was great to have you. I think this was definitely a super interesting session for us to launch into areas beyond just health.